Thank you for tuning in. We're going to go on a ride in this beautiful Sportster S. We're going to talk about why you cannot compare the Indian Scout Bobber and the Sportster S. I own both these motorcycles. I just want to give you my experience and why it's not fair to actually compare them. And they're such completely different bikes. That's what I'm learning the more and more I ride both bikes. In fact, sometimes I will ride the Sportster S, come back to my garage, and I'll take the Indian Scout Bobber for a quick spin. That's when you realize, just going from one bike to the other, how different these two motorcycles are. So let's talk about some of the differences and why it is so hard to compare them in a meaningful way, even though these two bikes kind of fall in the category of a sport cruiser, I guess. You know, it's between the full-blown cruiser and a full-blown sport bike. So it is very common for people to look at these two bikes and to see which one is better than the other. And that's a tough one, to be honest with you. Owning both these bikes, I can tell you from my experience. So let's talk about some of the differences and why it is hard to compare them. Let's talk about the engine, which is really the highlight of both motorcycles, especially the Sportster S. This engine, it's a 1250T Revolution Max engine with 120 some horsepower and 94 Newton meters of torque, compared to the Indian Scout Bobber, which is around 1133cc, 100 horsepower and 74 pounds of torque. I said Newton meters, but it's pounds of torque, both for 94 pounds of torque on this one and 74, I believe, on the Indian Scout Bobber. So right there you can see there's a huge advantage for the Sportster. It is a much bigger engine, it's way more powerful engine, and it rides completely different. This is tuned completely different than any other engines out there, even any other Harley or Indian engines out there. They both are liquid cooled, which is very nice. So riding the motorcycle, the biggest difference you will see is when you ride the Indian Scout Bobber, you feel like you're riding a American V-twin machine. You know, you can feel the engine, you feel connected to the road, you feel connected to the bike, and you can definitely, you know, once you change the exhaust on the Indian Scout Bobber, you will also hear the sound of the engine, which is nice. So it's a little bit more traditional motorcycle, the Indian Scout Bobber. When you ride the Sportster S, this is much more refined. The stock exhaust really doesn't make a lot of sound. It doesn't really have that American V-twin sound and feel to it. It feels like, it's almost like driving a Tesla versus a BMW in a little bit, I guess, you know, if I have to put it. So this is much more refined. You don't feel, the transmission is very different in this engine versus the Indian Scout Bobber. You don't really feel the gear changes. You don't feel the power just comes so instantaneously in every gear. So you're in second, third, fourth, fifth, it doesn't matter. You can just give the throttle and it will pull. That's not the case with the Indian Scout Bobber. So the Indian Scout Bobber, It does have power, but the power really shines through after 4,000 RPM. So if you have to rev that engine a little bit to get the power out. That's one thing I noticed about the Indian Scout Bobber. So if you're going in 6th gear and you want to overtake somebody, you have to kind of put that down to 5th gear and rev the Scout Bobber engine, and once it is past the 4,000 RPM, it will pull. But this bike, it could be on 6th gear, it could be on 5th gear. You don't need to shift down to pull. It will just go just like that. So you can't compare the power, because the Sportster S is significantly more powerful than the Scout Bobber, in my opinion. And Scout Bobber, you have to ride a little harder. This one, you really don't need to do much work. You just need to give the throttle and it just goes. That's why it is so hard for me to compare the two, because they both drive completely different, and I think they both give you completely different emotions and happiness when you ride it. They both are good, you know, they both are good, even though I wish the Scout Bobber had a little bit more power. Second, I also want to talk about the chassis. Remember, the chassis on this bike is the engine is part of the chassis. That's not the case with the Indian Scout Bobber. It is a long bike, so, and you sit, the ergonomics are completely different than this. You actually sit inside the bike, literally inside the bike, and you're riding. But this one, you sit on top of the bike. So the ergonomics point of view, they both are completely different, the way it is set up and the way they ride. So Indian Scout Bobber have a very low lean angle. It can definitely lean, not a problem, but it does have a low lean angle. But this one have a pretty high lean angle. But the disadvantage on this is, it could be a disadvantage, is sometimes the big front tires. It will lean, you have to push it with some muscle, but it's not as nimble as if this had like a smaller tire, or a thinner tire, it's not smaller tire. So that is one thing to keep in mind. I'm going to put this into sports mode, and I want to show you guys how quickly this bike can get up and go. And so that is what I want to talk about, the engine and the transmission. I think they're completely different, and they give you completely different feel and happiness when you ride them. You really cannot compare. One is more refined, way more power, and does not really feel like an American V-twin. See the pull here? That's what I'm talking about. So I'm on 5th gear. I simply just have to give it throttle and it will go. Indian Scout Bobber will get to speed. You know, you can go 110 miles, even push it to 120 miles on the Indian Scout Bobber. But the biggest difference is it takes a while for the ISB to get there, while this bike can get there so fast because of the amount of torque in this engine. So these are some of the reasons I think you cannot really compare the two engines. And the ergonomics, as I said, is completely different as well, and give you a completely different vibe and feel when you ride these motorcycles. I also want to talk about the looks, you know. So the Indian Scout Bobber, and actually let me just grade the engine first. The engine, I think Sportster engine is much better in terms of speed and power. So let's talk about the looks. So the looks wise, Indian Scout Bobber I think wins the looks department, because almost everybody that have seen my ISB when they come home and they look at the bike, they all like that bike. It looks really good, and it looks like a traditional cruiser. It sits really low, it looks muscly, it's really nice to look at, and you will not really get tired of the looks. Sportster S is a little bit dividing in that sense. There are people who don't actually like the look of this bike. I think this bike actually looks much better in person than in pictures. So you may want to just look at it, in person and see if you like it. The exhaust is obviously placed very differently than most motorcycles out there. So I think this one is really for people who actually want more like a concept bike, not a traditional looking motorcycle. So the looks can be a big factor for some people. So just keep that in mind. They look differently, and some people may not like the look of Sportsters, but I can tell you almost everybody likes the look of ISB from my experience, because I own both these bikes. That's why I'm speaking to this. Next, I want to talk about the fuel gauge. The electronics in both bikes. So this motorcycle have all the electronics you can think of, you can dream of up there. It's really up to par with modern electronics. It's got cornering ABS, anti-wheelie control, stability. So alright folks, as I was recording, the camera actually just turned off. So I'll continue my review, but I just want to mention one thing. If you guys are using GoPro, so the reason my camera turned off was because it said the SD card was full. In fact, the SD card was not full, so what I had to do is I had to format the SD card so it actually shows up as empty. This is all this craziness. So just make sure, if you get that message, and if you're doing vlogs, even if your SD card is not full, you may get that message, and you just need to plug that into a computer, and you can format that disk. Anyway, let's continuing on our review. We were talking about the technology and the TFT screen. So obviously this motorcycle have all the electronics you can think of, a lot of safety features that you can think of, cruise control. You can even install heated grips on this. There is a button here, you can install it. It doesn't come with it from factory. Plenty of electronics and new technology in this motorcycle. Obviously the Indian Scout Bobber don't have it. It does have ABS if you get the ABS model. So I think that is definitely something worth thinking about. If you want all those technologies, obviously this will win that comparison. So just keep that in mind. So we talked about the engine, we talked about the looks, we talked about the technology. I think both on technology side and the engine side, Sportster S is probably a clear winner here. And obviously the looks are subjective. I think they both look great. Scout Bobber probably have a much more classic look that most people will like. So I also want to talk about the reliability of both motorcycles. I have driven the Indian Scout Bobber for almost 5,000 miles right now. Owned it for a little bit more than a year, and the only thing I had to do was change oil one time, and obviously after the break-in service, and that's a very reliable engine so far. I have had no other issues. Just keep that in mind. But unfortunately Sportster S have a little bit of a bad reputation. Remember, this is their newest engine from Harley, so it's not tested for a long period of time. And if you look at the Facebook forums and things like that, there's a lot of people had a lot of issues with this bike. So that is a concern even for me. You know, I have 1,400 miles on it. Haven't really had much of an issue so far, other than battery issues, which was resolved by just plugging into the battery tender. You know, it does have a weak battery, unfortunately. So I haven't had any other issues, so I can't really speak to it. But it may be doing a little bit of research, maybe worth it, you know, before you go with one or the other. So that's something I just want to throw out. I think from the reliability point of view, I think the Scout Bobber probably wins so far from my experience. I also want to talk about value for money, right? So the Indian Scout Bobber obviously is lower MSRP compared to the Sportster S. The Sportster S, the price have gone up over the past 2 years since it first came out in 2021. So off the showroom, you are definitely looking at a bigger price MSRP for the Sportster S. When we think about value, it's not just only about price, what you get for that price, right? I do firmly believe you get a lot more for the money in this motorcycle, with the technology, with the powerful engine that it's got, and obviously there is a premium for that Harley name. So I truly believe this motorcycle definitely should be priced more than the Indian Scout Bobber, just because of the bigger engine and the technology and the other features this bike has over the Indian Scout Bobber. Then one other thing you should think about the Indian Scout Bobber, which is where I think value for the money, the Sportster is probably the winner, because Indian Scout Bobber right off the showroom comes with a lot of stock parts that you need to change. You know, for example, it comes with a stock halogen headlamp, which most people change. The seat and the suspension on the Indian Scout Bobber is really bad. I'm talking about the rear suspension, so you're going to be changing that. Then most people have to change the exhaust on the Indian Scout Bobber as well, almost everybody that I know, because it's huge and it sounds like a sewing machine. So if I just have to factor in the price of some basic upgrades, we're not even talking about some huge, you know, upgrades here. We're just talking about like basic stuff like headlamp, seat, you know, your rear shocks and the exhaust. So you will probably, if you buy the Indian Scout Bobber, you will probably do those upgrades right away. So I would say whatever you're paying right off the dealer, just add another $2,000, $2,500 to it for all these upgrades that you almost must make, you know, to ride it. So that kind of puts the price tag on the Indian Scout Bobber on par with the Sportster, which is interesting because I think when you factor in those upgrades, Sportster is definitely a much better value than the Indian Scout Bobber. So you may ask, like, hey, don't you have to do those upgrades in the Sportster S? You don't need to change the headlamp on Sportster S. You don't really need to change the seat and the shock on this. If you want to change the exhaust, it's up to you. But I'm actually so far happy with the exhaust this bike comes with. You know, it's quiet, but I'm okay with that. So I don't know what this guy is doing. He's got to go, and I'm going to put in sports mode. So I think for the value for money, I think Sportster S, it's probably on par or maybe better than the Indian Scout Bobber. I think. I know it's an interesting argument because you know, the MSRP of the Indian Scout Bobber is definitely lower than the Sportster S. But you know, just factor in some of the things I mentioned and you will see what I'm talking about. So those are my, you know, comparisons, if you want to talk about, our thoughts owning both the motorcycle. So one may ask, like, if I have to do it again, if I have to pick between the Sportster S and the Indian Scout Bobber, which one would I pick? That's a tough one, right? That's a tough one. I think I will probably pick the Sportster S. But at the same time, I really like my Indian Scout Bobber. So this is hard. So for those of you that is out there trying to choose between these two motorcycles, I would say just literally write down on a piece of paper what your priority is. If you want your motorcycle to look really good and ride like more like a traditional bike with sufficient power, not any crazy power, but sufficient, I believe, then I think ISB is probably your choice. But if you want a motorcycle in the sports cruiser category that can really go, has like really powerful engine, but at the same time don't want to pay, you know, $20,000-$25,000, you look at the Ducati Diavolo, which is priced around that $20,000 range, then you're really gonna be happy with buying this bike. One thing I can tell you, I have both motorcycles in my garage. I tend to ride this motorcycle more than my Indian Scout Bobber. But again, that is personal preference, because sometimes I like to go, I don't know if it is fast is the right word. I like to have that power if I need to just, you know, pass somebody. I like to have that power on tap. I think that's really what this bike gives you. It goes fast so quick because of the torque. So that's it for me, guys. What I'm gonna do next, this was my thoughts or comparison on both bikes riding the Sportster S. I'm gonna do a similar video while I'm riding the ISB. I want to see how, you know, I'm gonna be saying the same thing or different when I'm riding that bike, because, you know, when you're riding a bike, you feel attached to it, you feel there is a little bit of a bias. So I'm going to be riding the ISB and I'm going to give my thoughts. That'll be part 2 of this video that I will post. One big favor I have for you guys, I'm really trying to grow this channel, so if you can like and subscribe to my channel, just post some comments what your thoughts are, what you ride. I really appreciate it. And for all of you, please ride safe and cheers. Bye bye.